12 hours were to pass when next they discussed the enemy with a number of the men lazing about under the stars. Some snored, and others did not. There were more than 100 fires, as the 3,000 men brought north huddled together, appreciating the cool evening air, with several of them even bursting into song. Hardly paying them any mind, as he was not a man terribly interested in music, unlike his many friends, he was to devote himself in place of this to prayers. Prayers always helped before a battle, or so he believed, especially to Zeus, the war god. It was his view that a man ought to honor the war deity above all others, and that the others, such as Scotia, Fuflins, the fertility laird, and Tempestus, the queen of storms, were all secondary. They should be treated as such, he mused to himself, rather more suspicious of them than he was of his patron. A man should not have too many gods, after all, he told himself, lest he should become lost in the world. It was as his prayers to the war god came to an end that Melmodoc invaded his tent, huffing and cursing under his breath, complaining at some length of Norok and how he would have the lad gutted and stuffed like the pig that he was. Startled by the vitriol in his vassal's voice, it took Mael Martin some time ere he could calm the man down enough to speak sensibly.
What is it, Melmodoc? What is it, my good brother? What is it about Norok that has you so perturbed?
Perturbed? If you might say perturbed. Have you any idea what the little beast has done now?
Melmodoc bellowed, as might a wounded lion or would an enraged bull, his ruddy face scarlet with rage.
Nay, I shan't say that I do. Therefore, enlighten me, you plump oaf,
grunted Mael Martin, turning to his table, which lay just before the small shrine to the wooden statue of the war god he kept in his small tent. Pouring them both a drink of mead, he was to give one of the goblets over to the husband of his younger half-sister, Dowada, with the older man sloshing it all over his red tunic as he guzzled it down.
The little beast has resorted to telling the men he has misgivings about the coming night raid you have planned.
The revelation took Mael Martin by surprise. Never might he have expected such a betrayal from the seemingly leal and naive Mormaer. It made him grind his teeth. He might have said more to Melmodoc, who carried on with his complaints against their northern neighbor.
I shan't forgive that treasonous cur. Oh, something must be done about him. Give me leave to duel him, and he will be dead ere the dawn.
Nay, in the name of your bitten mother, do not do so, lest his kinsman turn upon me,
objected the monarch at once, adding with some thought, for he was ever a man to settle what debts he had.
Later, you should wait until after we have conquered and annexed the lands north of the Wend.
It was in this hour that he at last made the decision to inform the other man that Rory and his forces ought to take point in the battle that was to come, that he wished to honor the youth by placing his faith in the Mormaer. In this way, he hoped to forestall a withdrawal by the Highland men, and to make all wonder if it was cowardice that motivated the boy, or caution. His hope was to deny the Mormaer the ability to retreat. Such was the masculine nature of the Khalids with their fire blood, that such a challenge could not be ignored. Little did he expect when he had assembled his forces in the hopes to cross the river in the dead of night. He was dismayed and stunned to discover his deputy Melmodoc reporting once more in a temper.
The lad has withdrawn from the field with all his men, which have depleted us by 500.
Fuming with rage at this betrayal, he almost ordered the rest of his men about to attack those of Norok. It was a temptation that, had he given in to, might well have tasted sweeter than the finest of fruits or cow meat. Yet he knew therein lay the path to madness, for not since the days of his mad father had any monarch sought to attack their vassal. The Khalids had to be different from the endlessly divided Britians to the south of them, his cousin had whispered to him. It was one of the old man's many wise sayings that the prince had taken truly to heart and hoped to one day pass on to his own sons.
Never you mind him, we have a battle to see to,
said the High King, adding, foreseeing another objection from his friend,
later, you may scold or punish the boy as you see fit.
There, he mused to himself, though he himself could not kill the lad, it did not mean he could not have his vassal deal with him as he saw fit. The battle itself began not long thereafter, just when the moon was at its zenith. It was quite the sight by this time, with the few clouds seeking to cover its fullness. The roundness of the moon could well have enchanted even the least romantic of souls, with the light that radiated down upon the world from it, a reminder of the greatness of the gods, of their works. Quite why had they created 2 suns and only 1 moon could well have bewildered even the greatest of minds, yet it hardly distracted Mael Martin. His only thought lay with the river that continued to defy him, his realm, and the land of the Khalids itself. It was the wind that had for so long defied the wishes of the kings of the south and acted as a shield for the northerners. At one time, it was hardly even a boundary line back when Roma was still a power, yet times had changed, and now it was Caledonia that sought to become the greatest of all in the isle. The moon, he noticed when he glanced up, had begun to hide itself from those who inhabited the earth. It was in this hour that a wave of unease ought to have struck the warrior king, who defied the heavens with all the obstinacy that he was infamous throughout his lands for. It was this trait that made him the only possible successor to Constantine, for he would not kneel to any man, be they his cousins, his siblings, or even the heavens themselves. His was the warrior's path, he told himself, gathering his courage so that he gave a curt nod to his deputy, who drew up the war horn that was part of his inheritance. Always, the Mormaers of Fortriu had guarded the high kings of Caledonia with the horn of Fidelas Silver Arrow, a war horn that was said to have been forged by the wilder elf Fidelas, who had created it in the dawn of the previous kingdom and bestowed it upon Fidelas's cousin, Achaeus, as a gift. The elf in question had passed away some centuries ago, in the time of the Second Wars of Darkness, just south of the Firth of the Thurn. The horn blew and blasted across all the land, so that all knew to advance, and all who opposed Mael Martin knew fear. This had always been the way of the rulers of Caledonia. First the horn of the Mormaer of Fortriu, always their deputies blasted the greatest of the horns of the Calids. It was at this moment that all knew there could be no flight from this valley. From the lowliest of vales to the highest of mounts, and the most distant of isles, be it in the North Isles to those in the west such as Cull, all heard the blast of Fidelas's prized possession. This was to be the hour of darkness and slaughter. All knew as well in their bones as they did in their souls, and thousands felt their stomachs shrivel with dread for what was to follow. The charge of the Huskarls and warriors of the houses of the Calids was accompanied by that of those who had enlisted from their many fields. The many men of Caledonia reached the river in a matter of seconds, with their lairds and Mormaers at times ahead of them, at others just behind them. These were not the soft men of the south, of the lands of Britia, where lordly men feared battle and death. This was not the nature of Calid lairds, not even that of their monarchs, so that Mael Martin was in the forefront of the battle rather than in the rear. On foot, just as all the men of the Northlands were when the battle was joined, for they had no conception of the chivalry of the 12 kingdoms or cavalry warfare of Doria. Once, their ancestors had fought in chariots, but these had lacked practical use in mountainous terrain. Their preference, as it was for all men born to such rocky landscapes, was to fight on foot. Lo, it was for this reason, as much as his own innate valor, that was the cause for why Mael Martin was the first to bury his axe into the skull of one of his enemies. This was a good sign, he told himself, for not even the great king who had preceded him had ever accomplished this. Not since Kinayad the Founder had any performed this feat and showcased their heroism so early in a battle. The next blows that followed were parried, with the High King parrying each blow with his shield and retaliating with the hatchet passed down to him by his father. His men, taking heart, joined him with many a shout of encouragement.
Hark, hark! Lo, the enemy fights as poorly as one might expect,
he shouted to those who surrounded him in a lull in the combat. His words drew the hoped-for laughter as he grinned at the joy of battle, for this was his favorite of pastimes. Some might like to indulge in wine, others women, and still others songs, yet the present ruler of the Calids loved battle. Quite why Constantine had come to despise battle and bemoan the losses suffered to it was a source of scorn for him. All about him, victory was within their grasp within a matter of minutes, as those of the lands to the north of the wind fled at the sight of the Calids. Those of the lands of the High Mounts, as some had come to know them, were as terrible and wicked in that hour as the darkest of the dark elves who once invaded the Lordly Isle more than a century ago. Nobility of cause and reason faded, as the fireblood of the men of the Mounts was set ablaze, with those of the highest mountain peaks who had accompanied their ruler racing ahead. far more impulsive and violent by nature than those of the lowlands, who, though their own blood was far less full of flame, were still prone to running hot in such moments. They were, it must be known, dear reader, cousins of the Highlanders, and descended from men of the mountains who had ventured down from their natural homes. It was, as he took notice of a large, hulking figure ahead of him, one who had fought off two of the few Highlanders who had chosen him over their liege, Rory. Pleased to discover a worthy foe, he threw himself against this hulking man of pure muscle and sinew.
"Have at thee!"
he cried out in his native Khalid, unsure if the man would understand what it was he had uttered. He did, he thought, if briefly, so as the other man gave a slight nod. The two clashed, with their hatchets slashing and cutting at the air as they dodged, wove, and flew from one another, neither willing to risk all in a fatal charge, guarding and warding what blows they could with their bucklers. The sole difference between them was that Mael Martin was almost 2 feet shorter and far more bearded, with his long hair flapping behind him as he moved. The other man, in time, came to lose his patience with this battle, even as the High King's shield arm began to ache after parrying 3 blows. Grabbing at the monarch, he picked him up bodily off the ground. Wherefore he tossed him at once at the Huskarls who sought to come to the rescue of their liege. The agony that shot through each of the 3 once contact was made between the laird and servants, and the panic that raced through them immediately afterward made them scramble back to their feet. Slow to regain their feet, they were to let loose each a great scream when the enemy's mighty axe fell down upon the skull of the man to the left, swifter than lightning, drawing back, even as he was shoved to one side by the other guard who tried to scramble to his own feet, if with slightly more clumsiness than he might otherwise have preferred to demonstrate. It was a relief that Baltair Silvertongue was not present to see him at that moment. The last thing he wished for was for the court poet to see him then. Once upon his feet, he had little in the way of choice over what he ought to do. Mael Martin, as always, never hesitated or stopped to question himself over what he should do in such a moment. Thrown now forward, this time of his own volition, he was to throw his axe forward and through the flesh of the other man. The taller man let loose a great cry as the hatchet of Mael Martin's father, the Mad King, hewed its way through hauberk and flesh alike, tearing a hoarse shriek that brought to mind the cry of death itself. The giant in human flesh was to topple over backward, head over heel, as the monarch fell forward onto him. The monarch was swiftly joined by several of his men, who rallied behind him even as the enemy took several steps back, visibly daunted by the death of one of the mightiest of their numbers.
"To me, men, these mice are as nothing before our most masculine of natures and divinely gifted strength,"
Mael Martin crowed victoriously, even as he slashed the man through the throat. The cheers that echoed behind and all about him were as the song of a Khalid choir in the middle of a temple session. The battle carried on, with the fervor and passion that only the mightiest of men could muster. Gone was the sort of honor with which the previous monarch had fought with continuously, or the kings over in Gallia loved to ascribe to be replaced with a sort of northern bravery that bordered on savagery. There was no sense of dignity, of kindliness throughout the land just north of the Wend River. The battle did not abate for hours, for neither those who had crossed into the lands of the people dubbed by some as the Wends or the Wendi, nor did it abate for the Khalids. Though better armed and better prepared for this sort of war by the nature of their better contact with nations such as Brittia, Neustra, Norensia, and Astaria, this did not give them an unquestionable advantage over their foes. It was at this time that Rory might well have dashed forward, hither across the river to come to the assistance of his ruler, and not a moment too late it would have been had he decided to do so. Just as his arm arose, as he reached for his sword with his other hand, he froze at the sound of a distant war horn that came from the southwest. Far away, from somewhere beyond the horizon, there came at first mere specks. Then, with each passing moment, Nordic longships, arising in majesty with black, green, and crimson sails. They cut a path up the sea with no less determination than the legions of Roma once cut their way north into Caledonia. Gaping as the dragon ships of the enemy appeared, Rory turned now to one of his men to order him.
"Warn the High King."
By the time word reached Mael Martin, he was, to his mind, on the cusp of victory itself. Hewing his way forward, his charge had gathered momentum, and he was nearing the location where Sumnal's crow banner could be seen billowing in the wind. It was thereupon a slight rise he intended to slay his rival and hammer his authority over the lands of Norwind at long last. Already, he could taste the glory and hear the songs the poets would sing of this unparalleled deed, the likeness of which had not been equaled since the days of Cormac the hero, nigh on 2 millennia earlier.
Sire! Sire! Northmen are upon us!
Someone warned the king, who at first could only hear a buzzing sound, like that of a bird squawking irritatingly in his ears, frowning at this most grating of sounds, and at those men who heard it and sought to restrain and pull him back from his next advance against the enemy. It was only when Melmodoc reached out to grab him during a lull in the combat, even as the High King's personal guard fought alongside that of the Mormaers all around them.
Stop! Mael Martin, look behind us! There be Northmen to our rear!